Welcome, everybody, to CADEM Celebrates Transgender Day of Remembrance. My name is Tiffany Woods. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the LGBT Caucus co-chair for Northern California for the California Democratic Party. And the LGBT Caucus is co-sponsoring this along with California Democratic Party. This is our third annual Transgender Day of Remembrance event. And just wanted to be very clear that even though we are in the CADEM Celebrates series, that we are mourning, remembering, honoring, and fighting for our trans siblings and our gender diverse community across the world. So that is what we are doing today. And we're gonna go through, we have a packed, quick, really tight remembrance event. I'm gonna hand it over to my caucus co-chair for his welcome and greetings. Lester.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're glad to see you. As Tiffany mentioned, Transgender Day of Remembrance is an annual observance that honors the memory of transgender people whose lives were lost in acts of anti-transgender violence. It is a somber occasion. We won't be cracking any jokes except at our expense. And we're glad everybody's here. This is not just a day for transgender people. This is a day for all people of good faith to remember and honor the lives of those who have been lost to transgender violence.
Right. Thank you, Lester. So we would love for you to, if you could quick send out a message to other fellow Democrats and executive board members to come and join us. This meeting is also open to the public, so feel free to invite members of the public. We have an amazing guest speaker that we're going to be in conversation with. We're going to talk history today. We're going to talk perspective. We're going to connect the dots to the past, to the current, to the past, the present, and the future. So we're really excited about this conversation. We will be I'll be doing some trigger warnings throughout. We'll be talking about murder and violence. So we want everybody to do self-care. Take care of yourself. Feel free to turn off your camera, step away, leave if you need to. But it's important that we have this conversation, that we do recognize the anti-trans violence and the murder. This is what the day is about. So really self-care, take care of yourself. We will announce trigger warnings throughout. And so we will be doing a slideshow of about almost 400 gender diverse folks across the globe that have been taken violently from us this year. That will be at the very end. And then we're going to invite everybody to stay for a very uplifting, powerful closing. So we're going to send everybody out with some inspiration to fight and take action. So stay with us. I see everybody in the chat. Thank you. We're going to do some really quick. Let me do just a quick overview for the next couple of 10 minutes to kind of set the stage for our conversation. So we are winding down Transgender Awareness Month and Transgender Awareness Week, which will culminate, as Lester said, tomorrow, November 20th, is Transgender Day of Remembrance. So November is dedicated to education about the trans communities and important issues facing us, not just the anti-transphobia and the anti-violence, but discrimination, everything, just racial injustice, institutional, structural injustice, discrimination, stigma. So we're going to bring attention to all of that. This is what November and Transgender Awareness Week does. So we have organizations and community leaders and partners across the globe working hard to bring that awareness and attention. We also want to uplift our voices and experiences, successes of trans and gender nonconforming or gender diverse community. People have been doing that all week long. So I hope you're doing the same in your capacity as Democrats, as community leaders. So this is why we're doing this. All right, next slide. Trans Lives Matter, Remembering Our Dead. So this is a very important website. This is where we pull the slides. They do all the emotional labor of collecting the slides. Prior to doing this and having them do the work, we were all working to collect names and do our own slides. And so this is a very grassroots driven event. It should always remain grassroots driven and led by the community and be very, very clear. I led 11 of these in Alameda County for the city of Oakland and the East Bay from 2006 to 2017. Community leaders, trans community leading and putting this event on. So we're honored that we are able to do this through the Democratic Party to spread that awareness and remembrance. All right. And we're going to move on. So quickly, this is the International Transgender Day of Remembrance, founded by SFAR trans activist Gwen Smith. We are excited that she's joining us today, but we'll get to that pretty soon. And she'll tell you why she started it. That's one of the conversation pieces. But we see this slide, if you've done these for many, many years, and I have, we've got our trans community leaders also on this, who have been involved in San Francisco and other areas leading this. We all know the story. This is a grassroots event kicked off in San Francisco in 1999, honoring Rita Hester's murder, who nobody cared about. There was no attention. So that's what we're going to talk about, what it was like back then, what is like today. Next slide. Some data and some stats, because we want to make sure that folks have the data. So 2022 is now officially the deadliest year on record for transgender Americans. Last year, when we did this, we were at around 46, I think is the stats I read off. It is definitely over 50 that we know about. We say that we know about because there will always be cases that we will never know of trans folks dying violently without anybody able to honor them or remember them. Something that we're all working on changing, and that takes all of our responsibility. A majority were Black trans women, as is every year, also Latinx and young, and trans women of color, specifically Black trans women and Latinx trans women in South America bear the brunt of the violence. 2022, sorry, that is a misstep. The very first point should be 2021. 2022 has already seen at least 33 trans individuals fatally shot or killed by other violent means in the US at this point. We unfortunately know that those numbers will most likely rise. I believe there's been several more murders this week, which always happens as we are trying to gather the names and the slides. And the violence and killings never takes a break, even when we take a break to stop to mourn and remember our community and take care of our own. And globally, at least 396 trans and gender diverse folks were violently killed globally that we know of. So yeah, and it's probably over 400. So think about that. And we will be showing a slide with every single one of those. Next, the data is important. And it's a quick map really showing where our community has been slaughtered, for lack of a better word. I mean, let's just be real here. You can see Southern California, United States, Brazil has the majority of the killings. It leads every year, and other South American and Central American countries. Next slide. So these are always personal for us. And I want to bring into this space some very specific anniversaries and two trans women that were violently taken. So part of Day of Remembrance is remembering those taken this year, but we always want to hold in our heart and our souls those who have always been taken, who in the past. So just because we read their names one year doesn't mean that we don't read them again or we don't forget about them. The focus is this year is on those taken. But Gwen Rose Araujo and Brandon Martell are very personal to both Gwen and I. We have personal connections. And I've said in many, many interviews and media over the years when I was running my trans program and putting on my own events in Alameda County with the community, that if you run a transgender program or an LGBTQ center, or you're connected to the trans community in some capacity globally, is not a matter of will it happen to somebody I know? It's a matter of when. Will it be a member of my staff? Will it be my team, a coworker, a client, a community member? And that bears out every year. So really quickly for historical purposes, because we're going to have conversation, And this is the 20th year anniversary of Gwen Amber Rose Araujo's murder, October 4th in 2002. She was a trans teenager who was murdered in Newark, California at the age of 17. She was murdered by 4 men, 2 of them whom sexually intimate with her, and then beat and strangled her after discovering that she was trans. Her murder case was probably the first national and international media in case of a trans teen being murdered. I actually started the transgender program in Fremont in Alameda County as a response to Gwen a month later, after we found out that she had attended our GSA support group, and they didn't know what to do with a young trans teen. And so she never came back, and she was murdered about a month later. 10 years after I started that program, my own former team member, Brandy Martell, was murdered in Oakland at age 37 on April 29th, 2020. Sorry, I made a mistake on the date. 2012. She was shot while sitting in a car with 3 of her other trans women friends in an attempted robbery at 5:30 in the morning. She was a former peer advocate for me. I hired and mentored her, and her desk sat across from mine in my office, and she worked for my program. So they're connected to me. They're very personal to Gwen, and so we're going to have a conversation about their impact. Next slide. Part of Gwen's impact is the Gwen Araujo Justice for Victims Act. This was the nation's first law addressing the use of panic strategies. It was signed into law by Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006. The law limited the use by criminal defendants of the gay trans panic defense by allowing parties to instruct jurors not to let bias influence their decisions, including bias against the victims based on his or her gender identity or sexual orientation. This was prevalent with the 4 murder suspects throughout Gwen's trial. The bill was written by former Assembly member Sally Lieber, now just recently a Board of Education member, sponsored by Equality California. You should know that, for those who don't know the history, our current Vice President Kamala Harris, was the district attorney of San Francisco at the time. She was very instrumental in getting this bill up to being passed. She implemented a trans community town hall in San Francisco at the LGBT Community Center. Many of us were there and present there. She also convened a nationwide summit for district attorneys across the country to get their support to repeal the gay trans panic defense. So I just want to make sure that that is historically accurate, and her role in that. Next slide. All right. Significant impact this year that we hope will be impactful is AB 1741, signed into law by Governor Newsom June 23rd, introduced by Assemblymember Evan Lowe, chair of the California Legislative LGBT Caucus. It requires the governor to officially recognize the date each year as a day of special remembrance in the Golden State. We are expecting him to make that signing declaration on Sunday. Next slide. And that brings us to our guest speaker. So I'm really super excited to introduce our guest speaker today. Gwen Smith, founder of Transgender Day of Remembrance, early transgender internet pioneer, current journalist. Let me read off a quick bio of her. Just to give you really quickly, if you don't know who she is, you should know. She's been a transgender advocate for more than 2 decades. She's a writer of the Transmissions column for the Bay Area Reporter, among others. There you go. Her column's in its 22nd year. She founded the Transgender Day of Remembrance. She currently is active in the metaverse and virtual worlds. I'll let her talk about that. Her best known work on the internet, however, is Remembering Our Dead. She's the project founder in 1998 to chronicle the scourge of anti-trans murders. Through this project, Gwen founded the Transgender Day of Remembrance. The event's now 23 years old. And as we know, it's honored in hundreds of locations across the country and worldwide. And plug, biography of Gwen Smith, titled On Gwen, Transactive, was published by Wake Forest Press in 2017. I urge you to look it up and get a copy. And we are so honored Gwen is taking time out of this very emotional and busy week to join us in conversation. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And thank you I know it's been a very busy, and it's always an emotional and busy week for you with media
very much
and everything. So we're honored that you're taking some time out today. So let me talk about, we're just gonna jump in. Are you ready to just jump into this conversation?
Sure, why not?
All right, let's just jump into it. So here's my first question to you. There's been so much change in the way we now gather the information and report on trans murders. Before social media began driving greater awareness of the epidemic of trans violence, we know there's websites dedicated to it and social media pages and everything, but that's not always the case. That's always not been there. And it was you who took action, who cared enough to be moved to do action in a very grassroots way, as most movements are born in somebody said enough is enough and did something about it. And you did back in 1999, 98. So for those who were not old enough, not members of the trans community or LGBT community, maybe just not aware, can you just briefly take us back to that time period and talk about Rita Hestard and what it was like?
Oh, sure. I guess just to start on that, at that time, collecting data on anti-transgender murders was a much different world then. You didn't, we're fairly early in the growth of the World Wide Web at that point. Google isn't really around. You're not really doing web searches in the same way that we do today. A lot of the news sources weren't on the web yet, hadn't created their presences. You couldn't just look up a video. There was no YouTube. There was nothing like this. It was a very, very different world at the time. So you really had to rely more on other members of the community sharing information, passing that information along through much different channels, because there wasn't a Twitter or a Facebook or anything like this. You really had to kind of build local relationships and then build relationships with some of the few areas that were out there online for the trans community. The only real source you could find out there, for example, there were news databases like Lexis, which was the time commercial service for news broadcasters and producers to find information. It was fairly expensive, but you could still get in there for a price. But once you got in there, you had to figure out what you were going to be searching on to try to find individual cases. And the language that was out there at the time was not what we have today. Yeah. So if you were looking for information on an anti-trans murder, you couldn't say, for example, anti-trans murder. You couldn't necessarily use transgender to find cases or other community terms. What you ended up having to use were terms like man wearing a woman's clothing or wearing a dress. Or in the case of trans men or trans masculine people, it would be a bearded woman was killed, this sort of language. And so you learn to search, you had to search using that sort of terminology to even find our stories. Like I said, you had to do much more relying on the community, finding people who may have known someone who had passed who could provide that information to fill in what wasn't there in the news media. If they weren't reporting that someone was trans, or if they're using that sort of language, you'd be able to find that information, start to work back to put that information together and find these stories. And we still do that today, but it was a much more involved process back then with far less places to get together. And that brings me a bit to the Rita Hestard case itself. There were a couple of places out there at the time, primarily on some of the large services at the time, like CompuServe or Prodigy or America Online, which were online services that you could log into. That was the place then.
Yeah, AOL.com.
Exactly. Everyone had their CDs. And at the time, we had actually done a lot of work on America Online to allow trans discussions, and had created a forum there called the Transgender Community Forum, where we could meet and discuss and share our lives with each other. At the time, we had some regular online chats there. And in one of those chats, some of the individuals out of Boston had shared information about Rita Hestard's murder. There had been, I think, one piece that had been published in one of the papers. I want to say it was the Globe. But they started to share some of the information about the Hester murder. And for those who may not be aware, Rita Hester was an African-American trans woman. She was murdered near Boston, Alston, on November 28th of 1998. She had gone to one of the local bars the evening before and was found dead the next day. We were discussing this case, and I started to talk about how there were a lot of similarities between what happened to Rita Hester and the Chanel Pickett murder, which Chanel Pickett was also an African-American trans woman. She was also in the Boston area. She had been murdered on November 20th. That date should sound familiar, of 1995.
Yeah, I remember.
Again, after going to a bar that evening before. And so I started saying, not saying that there was any connection, but just saying that it's really interesting how these cases compare, that there's sort of a very similar situation. And the response I got back from people, even again, some of the Boston individuals who were in the chat was, well, who's Chanel Pickett? And it really struck me that this was a murder that had happened 3 years before. And the trial for her murderer, William Palmer, had wrapped up 15 months prior to the Rita Hester murder. So it was really a relatively short period of time. There had been a lot of discussion within the community when Pickett died and when the trial was ongoing. And yet here we were 15 months after that with a new murder that it felt like we were forgetting this entire community knowledge of the dangers that were out there.
The trial's over and we move on, right?
Yeah. And I was reminded of the George Santayana quote that those who forget their past are doomed to repeat it. And I really felt that we were seeing that actually happening and seeing our community kind of lose its collective memory. And that's actually what ended up leading to starting Remembering Our Dead, and that morphing later into Transgender Day of Remembrance.
And that, for those of us who always clicked on the website for information, that was the opening quote, his quote.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for walking through us. I know it's always hard to kind of go back and connect the dots and look at that to see, but I think it's important in this time, right? Trans history is so not revered as other parts of history, especially LGBTQ history. And in this current climate, as a journalist, with all that, trans youth just started 5 years ago, with this, no, we've all been here for centuries. Exactly. There's a whole lot of this thing going on that's not being remembered. And so that's why I really wanted to be in this moment and connect those dots from the past to the present to the future. All right, you ready? Thank you for that. Let's go to our next question. Again, I want to move us a little bit forward in our trans history timeline. So as I opened up about Gwen, for those in Northern California, specifically, we should know about Gwen. Many I know on this call, I'm looking at there, Chair Pelosi here, Christine Martin, we all were involved, remember Gwen. I transitioned 4 miles from her in Union City. At the time that she was murdered, I was actually working in Hollywood as a background casting director. But in 2002, she was murdered. 4 men were charged with beating her to death after the 17-year-old's body was unearthed from a shallow grave in the Sierra foothills. They murdered her in Newark, transported her, buried her in a shallow grave in Placer up by Apple Hill. And for those of you who've been up to Apple Hill and you go up to 50 Tourist Tahoe, which I'm not that far now from, there's a McDonald's where everybody stops in Placer, and they stopped to have breakfast after they murdered her and dug her grave, and then drove back to Newark and, told their friends for 2 weeks. Their friends were talking about it. The men said they committed the crime because they discovered she was trans. Gwen's murder was the first murder of a trans teen that impacted California and garnered national attention. But you just recently, as this coming up, and there was a remembrance in San Francisco recently, you wrote about her story and trial being very personal to you, because I know you were part of that. and going to the trial and reporting on it back then. But you just recently wrote about it as Gwen Araujo and the steady trickle of anti-trans violence, and you were connecting the dots then, as you always have. So tell us about her impact 20 years ago and still today.
Well, and yeah, as you mentioned, it's really one of the first kind of cases to really gain a national attention as well, where you started to see a lot of national and outside of the country media pay attention to this issue. I think it was, a lot of people looked at how heinous the murder was. Again, you talked about the murderers going to McDonald's afterwards as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't spent hours brutalizing this person, killing this person, burying her, and then acting as if nothing had happened.
And I will tell you, not to interrupt you, but I drive past that. That's where we get our Christmas tree. And I drive past that. The first time I drove past that McDonald's, it just like, I got this, it came over me in the car. Like my kids are like, "Oh, can we stop at McDonald's?" And I'm like, "No,
maybe not now."
Not now. Yeah, it's there. Like it's a physical monument marker reminder of that. Like,
yeah, absolutely. I know that towards the end of the trial, there was a period of time where I was with Sylvia, Gwen's mother, and we were in a car together, and she stopped in front of this house and she said, "Right there," and pointed, and it was the house where she was killed. And it was just, you could just feel the air chill.
Yeah.
It was when I think about the case just on a personal level, I think about that day when I first heard about the murder. I'd been talking with a trans activist friend of mine, and when you spend a lot of time researching all these cases, you gain this sense of, it's this horrible feeling of, it's been too long since there's been a case, there's going to be one happening.
Yeah.
And I'd actually talked with her that day and said, "It's been 2 weeks. This is wrong." And shortly after that, I went downstairs, walked into the front room. A roommate of mine was watching the local news. I think it was KTVU. And I saw the first pictures that were being presented of Gwen on the news. And it was like that immediate, that here's the case. I ended up going to her funeral, which was very difficult.
Yeah.
I know a lot of us did. I attended the trial very regularly, got to know the family very well. But at the same time, you're sitting in a courtroom with her killers, and you're looking at forensic photos of her death, and you're looking at items that were used with her death, the rope they tied her up with, this kind of thing. And it does make it a very personal situation. One of the nice things about it was I did get to know her family, but you also then see how much this death affected them and still affect them to this day. I mean, Sylvia still has a lot of issues. Who wouldn't, as far as the impact, you already mentioned AB 1160, which has limited the trans panic defense, was one of the most obvious big things to come out of that. The family also changed her name in the course of the trial from her birth name as a way to let the media know to use Gwen Amber Rose Araujo and to use she, her. And it helped change that dialogue on how does the media address trans people and our deaths, and what do they call us? Do they go by the police report? Do they go by the family's wishes? Do they go by the person's wishes? There's still a lot of fights on that today, even 20 years after Gwen. But that's still something that's going on and will continue to.
And will continue. I invited Gwen Araujo, Sylvia, to Brandy's Day of Remembrance when we were going to read her name in 2012. And she was a guest speaker. And she looked over at Oakland Police Department. I had Mayor Kwan and I had our PIO officer, and it just gave chills. She looked over, and at this time, no suspects. And she just agonizingly looked at the mayor and Officer Watson and said, find her killer. Don't let them go, their family go through what we went through. Give them closure, justice. It's like, wow. I mean, it really brings it to home. And obviously there was no trial because it was a very different circumstances than being in the room with the killers. But thank you for walking us through that. I think it's really important that we know that these murders still have impact, right? Readers,
and I think
Rita has her impact. Look at the impact of that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, one of the things that you were saying there is specific to that. If we're talking about the importance of the Guanajuato murder, it gained that much attention, and yet there's been thousands upon thousands of murders since then.
Yeah.
And there are families out there that lost loved ones, and that their families have been sundered in the same way. And there's another life that's been lost, and who knows what Gwen could have done. At the very least, she could have lived a happy life. And that was taken from her, and it's been taken from so many others.
So much treasure and talent taken. And there's a new documentary that just dropped this week on her life.
Yes.
Yeah. So I haven't seen it. I haven't had time. We've been busy. I know you.
Yeah, I was actually part of that production and haven't had a chance to sit down and watch it either.
Perfect. I'm hoping that we can drop that in the chat or send out afterwards. I know it's going to bring up a lot of memories, so I'm trying to preface when I'm going to watch that. Okay, so let's move along in this conversation. We have more to talk about. I'm going to bring up our next question. So, as I said earlier, Assemblymember Evan Lowe, chair of the LGBT Legislative Caucus, introduced AB 1748 this year, requiring the governor to sign it. The question is that I'm thinking about this, and you and I talked about this over email. What are your thoughts on this grassroots efforts that you started 21 years or so, 22 years ago, that's now this global event? More events are added each year, more countries. What are your thoughts about this, and where do you think this legislative act of this policy now that started from your grassroots movement? What do you think the impact? Where is there going to be an impact to this?
Yeah, it's. I kind of go back, and I touched on it a little bit before. Kind of my feelings going into the initial project, and I can remember back at the time. Walking home from a BART station to where I was living at the time out in Bay Point, and talking with a friend of mine as we walked together, and feeling like, I'm going to be doing this thing and looking at all these cases, and I really feel like I'm just going to be shouting into the void. Nobody wants to hear about these murders. Nobody's going to care, but I got to do it, And I really went into it with that feeling of this is something that I have to do, but I really don't. I really worry that nobody is going to care. And so it's really surprising to me on a very deep level that it has become the event it's become. And then with AB 1741, seeing that brought out publicly, seeing that pass, it's a pleasant surprise. It's something I didn't expect to see. It's actually funny. I didn't even know that the bill was progressing, or it happened until a reporter from the Bay Area Reporter, where I also write, contacted me and say, "So do you have a comment about this?" And I'm like, "About what?" But I think that it's impact wise, I think that it's important because, and I'll probably talk about this forever, we need to continue to build that awareness. We need to continue to get people to understand this issue. And having this helps us move that forward. It helps us move to a time where maybe we can see transgender lives celebrated more often than mourned.
Yeah.
because really, ultimately, we need the most basic of human rights first and foremost, and that's the right to exist.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to preface that we are fighting for our right. Fighting. This is an memorial. We honor, but we fight. Right. So fighting for our right to exist. I'm going to bring on my co-chair, Lester, to let's talk about where we at today.
Sounds good.
And I'm going to take a quick break.
Hi, Gwen. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Yourself?
Oh, well. It's emotional for all of us. It's important. So we're a political organization, and we think about politics, and we're activists, and we think about what can we do to help. So we wanted to take some time to talk about the anti-transgender bills that are getting passed all across the nation. 33 states have introduced more than 100 bills that aim to curb the rights of transgender people across the country, with advocacy groups calling 2021 a record-breaking year for such legislation. Texas introduced the most with 47 bills. We have a map of where these bills have been passed or are pending. And as you can see, it's actually 36 states this year with bills signed into law in many of those places. Florida, of course, would run this sanctimonious, is one of the worst offenders. In April, the Surgeon General of Florida, under guidance of Governor DeSanctimonious, issued guidance through the Florida Health Department seeking to bar gender-affirming medical care, as well as social gender transition for minors in the state. In August, the Florida Agency for Healthcare Administration, under DeSantis, finalized new rules that ban healthcare providers from billing the state's Medicaid program for gender-affirming treatments. This is a big target for them. They say that they're protecting the youth. And finally, Florida Board of Medicine held a meeting to discuss a ban on gender-affirming care from transgender minors statewide. So I guess that takes us to the question, as a journalist, you cover trans issues with a personal lens, including anti-trans legislation and their impact. Could you talk to us a little about the current landscape of anti-trans hate and the unprecedented levels of legislation sweeping the US targeting trans youth, and how they fuel anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ violence?
Sure, absolutely. Over the last 4+ years, going on 5 years, we've seen a really rapid uptick in anti-transgender violence in the United States. And it's one that can't be explained by statistical anomalies or other issues of trying to find information. We're just seeing this where every year becomes the deadliest year on record. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as we've seen the political landscape that uses trans lives as a weapon, whether it's narratives around Leah Thomas swimming for the University of Pennsylvania, or 11-year-old Kai Shapley and her family being allowed to just live in Texas without the family being accused of abusing. That we're also seeing at that same time this increase in anti-transgender violence. As trans people are demonized by lawmakers, the message that they're sending is falling on the ears of those looking for a target. As these lawmakers and others are casting transgender people, as they have so many other minority groups, as the cause of decay in this country, they too have also painted us as less than human. It only follows that people will use this as fuel for their own fires, that trans people and our families are the ones that get to bear the brunt of that. It's to me, a very obvious link.
Thank you. So the next question is related. In your November transmissions column, Sounding the Alarm, you write very alarmingly about the horrific actions of the governor of Florida. I'm tired of saying his name, so I won't. Has been taken to intentionally, cruelly harm and erase trans youth and adults in the state of Florida. And you ended with this statement: that is also a warning. And not being alarmist, our lives are very much on the line. Can you talk about Florida's impact as well as Texas on the rest of the country? And on what can we in California do to help fight the recently passed SB 107 trans refuge bill?
Sure.
I'm sorry, that's actually a good thing.
Yeah. It's really frightening to watch the actions of Abbott in Texas or DeSantis in Florida. The latter, of course, in particular, is leading the way with the April Florida Department of Health actions to try to bar gender-affirming care, as well as you mentioned social medical transition or social gender transition, when we get my language correct, which I feel it's important to note on that simply means, a haircut or a change of clothing. We're not talking about any sort of medical procedures or anything like that. It's just accepting someone for who they say they are. They've the Florida Parental Rights and Education Act, which was HB 1557, which we know more successfully as the Don't Say Gay bill, which was so broadly written that a lot of educators do not know what they can or cannot say. A lot of their administrations don't know, and it's causing a lot of problems for people as a result of that. You then have Texas with HB 672, which aims to label gender-affirming care as abuse, as child abuse, and threatens families of being ripped apart and kids being thrown into an already overwhelmed Texas foster care system. They also have a bill now, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but to label drag performances as potentially, abusive and outlaw those. That is also written so broadly that it can affect, a trans person attending or performing in anything within the state. It could effectively bar a lot of trans people from being able to be out in the world just on a day-to-day basis. And these laws, as you can easily guess, very much impact the ability of transgender people to live full lives. If you can't get care, if your family is barred from, if your family can't accept you because they don't want to be accused of child abuse, if you can't participate in nightlife, if you can't do anything, that's obviously going to affect your quality of life in a huge way. And it's very scary to see that. We are, of course, you mentioned SB 107. We are seeing people who are having to flee Texas and Florida at this point as refugees to other states. As a result, I do feel that SB 107 is a huge boon to those families who need to get out and find a new place. But I also fear what are we going to see in the next House on the federal level? What are we going to see in 2024 when DeSantis is very likely to run for president? What's going to come out, even if he is unsuccessful, which I absolutely hope that he is, we're still going to see that rhetoric ramp up again and cause more problems. I think that there are still things that can be done. I think that SB 107 is huge. Don't get me wrong on that. I don't want to downplay the importance of that bill, but there's still a lot we can do. We can look at trying to educate more. We can look at trying to advocate more and speak up for trans people and elevate trans voices, particularly in areas where in this state that are less accepting. There's still room for steps on trans medical care, trans education, so forth. So that's, some of the steps that I think can potentially be looked at and see what's possible. I also wanted to note, coming out of the midterms, that aside from Florida and Texas, aside from Abbott and DeSantis, a lot of those who are pushing strong anti-transgender messages, throwing up stories about, kids using litter boxes in schools because they identify as furs. A lot of that, those candidates didn't do very well. And I think that that bodes well. It tells us that their message can be defeated. Yet we still face these threats, from the DeSantises of the world.
Thank you so much. I think Tiffany's coming back to kick
Yeah.
off the end of
Well,
our
hold
program.
on. So I think we had, I'm just absorbing everything that you're saying. And I know we don't have a huge audience, and it's always about who is here. And so since I have you, and we do have a little bit, and we are going to go over with the slideshow and then a powerful video closing. Would you mind taking 1 or 2 questions if they drop it in the chat?
Sure. Why
Since we
not?
have you, I mean, I'm all about if I have access to somebody, and I know we have some of our great Democratic leaders here on. So again, back to our attendees and participants, thank you for being here. If you would like to ask her a question, we're not going to unmute some technical stuff, but if you have a question that you want to drop quickly into the chat, we'll take at least 2 questions really quickly before we move on. And but I will, while if you're got a question, type it in, but I want to read, just kind of go to the chat really quickly. I see as a trans woman, as a cisgender woman, I've always been grateful to my parents who, beginning when my sisters and I were growing up in San Diego County during the 40s and 50s, model acceptance of anyone who was a decent, kind, and compassionate person. Our lives would have been much poorer if we had learned from their actions, including membership in the Democratic Party. Thank you for sharing that, Marilyn. Any other thoughts in the chat? If you can think about a quick question, one's happy to answer that. I did put the information for the opening music in the chat. We're going to close with that. From our Justin Howard, many blessings, everyone, on this sad day. May we move towards a more inclusive world where we all can just be ourselves. Thank you, Justin, for that blessing. So Justin also says, sending love, how do you suggest we help trans people in our communities to be able themselves? And then I have a second question from Lisa. What can allies do to be most supportive? So we'll take the first one for Justin. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Lisa.
I think both of those almost tie together. The number one thing that I feel you can do for transgender people as an ally to help transgender people is to listen. Listen to what we have to say. Understand that we are living this life, that this isn't, avoid the assumptions about what our lives are and hear what we have to say and help to amplify our voice so that other people can hear it. That to me is the first and most important thing.
Perfect.
Beyond everything else, beyond any advocacy, is being able to listen to us and understand us.
Yeah. And I would add, from my experience, is let us guide
Mm-hmm.
actions and conversations. Last question from our DNC member, Keith Umamoto, one of my Sacramento fellows, Sacramento. What are your thoughts with Lisa Middleton running for state senate? Thank you, Keith. And we'll end that question session.
I actually had the benefit of meeting Lisa a couple of years back, and I'm really excited about that. We've had some really great, amazing trans politicians across the country that have made a huge, huge impact, and Danica Rome, Sarah McBride, so forth. And I'm really excited to see the potential of Lisa Middleton joining those ranks.
It's a Democratic Party. We have to end on a political tie-in
Yep.
as well. So thank you for that. I am so grateful that you've taken the time. It's been a long time since you and I have spoke. I was reminding folks that 2005 in Hayward at the Cesar Chavez Middle School, we spoke, and we were so terrified of the audience, which were middle school kids in 2005. So it's been a long journey. Thank you for taking the time. We're going to transition into our remembrance. Your mother, welcome to stay. And then we're going to read our California murders, and then we're going to go into the slideshow. So thank you so much. And take care of yourself during this time, and always. And
thank you for having me.
We'll see you on Twitter.
You bet. While it's there.
While it's there, the Titanic is going down. All right. So we are going to now transition into reading names. We have one slide, so really quickly a trigger warning again. Thank you. Take care of yourself during this time. Feel free to turn off your cameras, step away. But we want to recognize that we've had 2 California murders, and then we will go into the slideshows. Lester, do you want to?
You wanted me to read?
Go ahead and read Sherry. Remember her?
Okay.
Sherry.
Sherry Bush lived in Sylmar neighborhood here in the San Fernando Valley in California, where she was experiencing homelessness at 48 years old, which was shot and killed on July 5th, 2022. On social media, her brother called her his oldest friend.
And we have a report of a murder of a trans person shot and killed in Vallejo on Monday, this Monday, November 14th, with another trans person in critical condition. No names have been released yet. I have actually been in contact with Vallejo police and been asked to assist with some with their PIO. So this is all the information we have. So we do want to make sure that we are aware. Again, incidents happen while we are trying to remember folks. So we are going to now transition into the slideshow. We are going to show every slide. The Remember Our Dead website and Transgender Europe and all the trans activists, they do the emotional labor that Gwen started and labored for so many years. They put all the details together, and we really want to recognize that and how much emotional labor and PTSD that this does bring up for us and for our community. Again, take care of yourselves. We will linger on each and hold each slide for about 5 seconds in order to give dignity and respect for each person. But please come back, stay with the Touch Slideshow. Come back afterwards. We're going to close with that opening song is a very powerful women video. We want to leave you with some uplifting, inspiring, just call to action to keep fighting for all of our lives. And so stay with us because we're not going to just end it. We're going to go over a little bit, but that's okay. You can't tie up all these little bows in 1 hour. So stay with us. And on that note, we will transition.